Goldie Hawn's laugh is one of the most recognizable sounds in American entertainment history. Bright, breathy, and seemingly effortless, it became shorthand for joy itself, an instant signal of innocence and charm in a world that often felt too serious. To millions of viewers in the late 1960s and 1970s, she was the embodiment of lightness, the giggling blonde in psychedelic paint on television screens, the carefree presence in films, the woman who seemed to float through fame without being touched by it. But the truth behind that image was far more complicated. Before the laughter became iconic, there was discipline, rejection, anxiety, and an internal struggle that rarely matched the external performance. Goldie Hawn did not arrive in Hollywood as a polished star. She arrived as a trained dancer who had been told repeatedly that she was not quite right, not quite serious, not quite enough. The world saw spontaneity. She lived through structure, fear, and persistence. Her story is not simply about fame or comedy. It is about identity, how it is shaped by expectation, distorted by perception, and eventually reclaimed through resilience. Beneath the public persona was a woman learning how to survive being underestimated, and then learning how to use that underestimation as fuel. What follows is not just the story of a star, but of a transformation. From disciplined child to dismissed dancer to cultural icon, who quietly rewrote the rules of Hollywood success. Early discipline, ballet, mirrors, and the making of perfection, Goldie Hawn's earliest years were shaped by structure rather than spontaneity. Born in Washington, D.C., and raised in suburban Maryland, she grew up in a household where music and discipline coexisted. Her mother, determined that her daughter would have opportunities she never had, enrolled her in ballet at an early age. By the time she was a toddler, she was already being shaped into something precise. The ballet studio became her first proving ground. It was a world of mirrors and correction, where every movement was measured against an invisible standard of perfection. Teachers demanded control, posture, and emotional restraint. For a child still discovering her own body, the message was constant: improve, refine, correct, repeat. In that environment, Goldie learned discipline before she understood confidence. She learned how to endure criticism without argument and how to persist through exhaustion. But she also absorbed a quieter lesson, one that would follow her for decades. She was never quite aligned with the ideal being presented to her. Her body was too expressive, her energy too lively, her natural presence too uncontained for the rigid expectations of classical ballet. Even as she developed technical skill, she began to internalize a sense of inadequacy. The mirror reflected not just movement, but judgment. And in that reflection, a pattern began forming. External approval was conditional, and perfection was always just out of reach. That tension between discipline and self-doubt would become one of the defining undercurrents of her life. Adolescence and anxiety, the invisible struggle by her teenage years, Goldie Hawn had developed more than just dance technique. She had developed an internal landscape marked by anxiety. It began subtly, a tightening before performances, a sense of unease before auditions, a feeling that something could go wrong even when nothing visibly was. At the time, there was little language for what she was experiencing. It was not framed as a condition or a pattern. It was simply part of life. She pushed through rehearsals, performances, and academic expectations, while privately wrestling with sensations she could not explain. Socially, she never fully fit into a defined category. She was known for dance, but not embraced as an academic standout or a conventional social figure. That partial visibility created its own pressure. She was seen enough to be judged, but not grounded enough to feel secure in how she was seen. As she grew older, another layer emerged: perception. People often assumed that her appearance, blonde hair, bright expression, natural warmth reflected her entire personality. This led to a quiet disconnect between who she was internally and how she was interpreted externally. The assumption of simplicity frustrated her, but it also sharpened her awareness of how quickly people categorized others. That awareness did not immediately translate into strategy, but it planted something important. she began to notice that perception was not fixed. It could be shaped, performed, and eventually redirected. Even in adolescence, that realization would quietly begin forming the foundation of her future career. Early adulthood rejection and the go years. As she moved into early adulthood, Goldie Hawn pursued dance professionally, believing that discipline and persistence would eventually lead to opportunity. Instead, she encountered a consistent pattern of rejection. Auditions often ended with vague feedback that pointed to something deeper than skill. She was told she was too lively, too soft, too expressive, too unconventional for the roles available. These critiques were not just professional, they were personal in tone, suggesting that her natural presence did not align with industry expectations. For someone trained in precision, the ambiguity of rejection was especially difficult to process. To support herself, she took work wherever it was available, including go dancing in clubs during the 1960s. The environment was far from the structured world of ballet. It was loud, chaotic, and commercially driven. Performers were expected to entertain continuously, regardless of personal discomfort. At first, the transition felt like a step downward. Years of disciplined training seemed reduced to performance designed for attention rather than artistry. Yet within that space, something unexpected developed. She learned how to hold an audience without perfection. She learned timing without choreography. She learned presence without permission. What seemed like compromise gradually became education. She began to understand that attention itself was a skill, not simply something given, but something directed. That insight would later become central to her success, though at the time it was simply survival within a world that offered few alternatives. Breakthrough Laughing and the Birth of an Image. In 1967, Goldie Hawn auditioned for a new television program that would soon redefine her life, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. The show was unconventional, fast-paced, and designed to break traditional variety show structure. It valued spontaneity, absurdity, and visual impact. During the audition, she did not attempt to conform to expectations of controlled performance. Instead, she leaned into instinct, laughing, reacting, and moving with an unfiltered energy that contrasted sharply with more rehearsed performers. That immediacy became her defining quality in the eyes of producers. When Laugh-In premiered in 1968, it quickly became a cultural phenomenon. Goldie Hawn was placed at the center of its visual identity, painted in psychedelic designs, dressed in revealing costumes, delivering lines with a mixture of innocence and timing that audiences found irresistible. The public response was immediate and intense. She became one of the most recognizable faces on television. But the recognition came with simplification. The character she played began to merge with how audiences perceived her as a person. The distinction between performance and identity blurred. To viewers, she represented carefree humor and visual charm. To the industry, she represented marketable energy. Few paused to consider the person behind the role or the discipline it took to maintain that consistency week after week. Fame arrived quickly, but understanding lagged behind it. Public perception, the cost of being underestimated as her visibility increased, so did the gap between public perception and private reality. Goldie Hawn became widely associated with a dumb blonde archetype, a label that reduced her complexity into something easily consumable. This perception was not simply media-driven, it was reinforced through repetition. The giggle, the costumes, and the comedic framing created an image that audiences embraced because it was simple and familiar. Complexity was not required for appreciation, and so it was often ignored. Privately, however, the experience of fame was not effortless. She struggled with anxiety and emotional overwhelm, especially in the early years of public attention. The pressure of being constantly visible, combined with the lack of privacy or nuance in how she was interpreted, created internal strain. Yet within that tension, something strategic emerged. Rather than resisting perception directly, she began observing it. She studied how timing affected laughter, how presence influenced attention, and how repetition shaped belief. Without formal intent, she was learning the mechanics of audience psychology. What others dismissed as simplicity, she quietly analyzed as structure. This shift, from being defined by perception to studying it, became one of the most important turning points in her career. Behind the laughter, internal pressure, and emotional reality, while audiences associated Goldie Hawn with joy, her internal experience was far more complex. The demands of constant performance created emotional fatigue, and the pressure to maintain a consistent public persona often left little room for vulnerability. Periods of anxiety intensified during peak fame. Physical symptoms such as rapid heartbeat and overwhelming fear would occasionally surface, particularly before appearances or high-pressure moments. These experiences were private, rarely acknowledged publicly, and even less understood at the time in broader cultural conversations. Despite this, she continued working, moving between television, film, and public appearances. The expectation was continuity, consistency of tone, expression, and energy. What made this period particularly difficult was the lack of separation between identity and image. When audiences responded to the character she portrayed, it often felt as though they were responding to a simplified version of her entire self. That distortion created emotional distance between internal reality and external recognition. Still, she did not withdraw. Instead, she adapted. She learned how to compartmentalize performance and personal experience, maintaining functionality in a system that rarely allowed for pause. Reinvention, intelligence behind the image. As her career progressed, Goldie Hawn began shifting from performer to creative participant. She became more selective about roles and increasingly aware of the structures behind filmmaking and comedy. Her performance in Cactus Flower, 1969, marked a significant turning point, earning her the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. The role revealed depth that audiences and critics had previously underestimated, challenging assumptions about her range and capability. This recognition did not erase the light image associated with her, but it complicated it. She was no longer solely defined by television comedy. She was now also recognized for emotional nuance and timing in film. Behind the scenes, she continued observing how entertainment systems functioned. She studied production, storytelling, and audience engagement. Over time, this curiosity evolved into participation. She became involved in developing projects and later expanded into production work. This transition reflected a broader shift, from being positioned as talent within a system to engaging with the system itself. Legacy beyond performance. Goldie Hawn's legacy extends beyond filmography or awards. Over time, she became associated not just with performance, but with longevity in an industry that often discards women as they age. Rather than disappearing from public life, she evolved within it. Her later work in education, wellness, and mindfulness reflected a different kind of public contribution, one less focused on entertainment and more on emotional resilience and mental well-being. This phase of her life highlights an important dimension of her story. Reinvention is not a single moment, but an ongoing process. The same person once defined by external perception became someone increasingly involved in shaping internal strength for herself and others. Her journey also reframes success. It is not simply about recognition, but about sustainability, not just about visibility, but about self-definition within visibility. Conclusion: the real meaning of the Smile Goldie Hawn story is often remembered for its surface. The laugh, the charm, the effortless joy projected through screens for decades. But beneath that surface lies a far more layered narrative, one built on discipline, rejection, adaptation, and quiet intelligence. She did not begin as an icon. She became one through a combination of persistence and reinterpretation of what it meant to be underestimated. What the world once labeled as simplicity was, in reality, a form of adaptability. What appeared effortless was often carefully learned. What seemed like performance was also survival. Her greatest achievement is not confined to awards or roles, but in longevity of self through changing perceptions. She remained visible without being fully defined by visibility. In the end, her story is not about a woman who is simply lucky or naturally joyful. It is about someone who learned how to exist within misunderstanding without being consumed by it, and in doing so, she transformed the very thing that was meant to limit her into the foundation of her lasting legacy.